long before Queen Marika rose to power, before the Golden Order defined life and death. This world belonged to something older, something wilder, the age of the crucible, when all life was tangled together, and the gods had not yet decided what the world was supposed to be. From that primordial beginning came dragons, giants, ancient civilizations, and eventually the rise of the Erdtree itself. But every age leaves behind its scars, and every order is built on the ruins of the one that came before it. Tonight, we are going to trace the full timeline of the lands between, from the earliest myths of the Crucible to the Night of Black Knives and the war that shattered the world. So settle in, and if you enjoy deep lore journeys like this, consider subscribing. And let's begin at the very start of the world. In the earliest reach of time, before the influence of the greater will or the establishment of any celestial order, there existed only the one great. This was a state of absolute total singularity, where the concepts of identity and division had no meaning. Within this primordial unity, all that distinguishes one thing from another was not yet fractured. There was no light to contrast with the dark, no heat to pull away from the cold, and no life to be measured against the inevitability of death. It was a silent and encompassing whole, containing the potential for all existence within a single, indivisible point of reality. The birth of the world, as it is understood today, was not an act of gentle creation, but a violent process of fracturing. This cosmic rupture forced the one great apart, birthing the dualities that would eventually govern the lands between. Through this division, the world gained its definition and its complexity, but it also gained its capacity for suffering and conflict. The fracturing created the distinct paths of the soul and the flesh, establishing a tension between the celestial and the terrestrial that continues to pull at the fabric of existence. Every breath taken in the modern age is a direct result of this original, ancient separation. According to the interpretations of the Three Fingers, this fracturing was a fundamental error that introduced pain and sorrow into the universe. From their perspective, every distinction is a wound, and the goal of existence should be to return to that original, undivided state. They believe that the greater will, by imposing order and hierarchy, merely exacerbated the suffering of the split. However, it was this very fracturing that allowed for the development of individual consciousness and the varied forms of life that would later inhabit the crucible. Without the divide, there would be only the silence of the singularity. The energy released during this fracturing became the raw material for the cosmos. It manifested as the primeval currents of glintstone and the golden embers of divinity that would eventually fall to the planet. This was the moment that time began to move forward, as the static eternity of the One Great was replaced by the dynamic evolution of a splintered universe. The dualities of existence became the new law, forcing all things to define themselves by what they were not. The light could only be understood in the shadow, and life could only be valued because of the shadow of death. As the divisions became more pronounced, the disparate elements began to coalesce into the first forms of matter and spirit. The world was no longer a single thought, but a vast and chaotic landscape of potential. The fracturing ensured that the lands between would be a place of constant change and struggle, as the various pieces of the One Great sought to find their place in a broken world. This original trauma remains the subterranean theme of all Elden Ring history, as every god and lord who followed would attempt to mend or further divide the world according to their own vision. The One Great eventually became a distant memory, a mythological baseline for the civilizations that rose in the wake of the fracture. While the Golden Order would later claim that its law was the beginning of all things, the truth lies in the ancient unity that existed before the stars were counted. The fracture was the catalyst for everything that followed, from the first sprout of the crucible to the final shattering of the Elden Ring. It was the moment that the silence ended and the long, loud history of the lands between truly began. In the wake of the original fracturing, the raw vitality of the world gathered into a singular pulsing center known as the primordial crucible. This was the ancient form of the Erdtree, a state of existence where all life was once blended together in a chaotic and fertile soup of potential. In this era, the boundaries between different species were fluid and indistinct. The crucible was a place of absolute biological abundance, where the energy of the One Great manifested as a wild, untamed growth that ignored the rigid classifications of modern divinity. During the age of the crucible, physical features like horns, feathers, tails, and scales were not seen as deformities or signs of a curse. Instead, they were regarded as marks of divine favor and manifestations of the crucible's overwhelming life force. To possess these traits was to be closer to the source of all life. The ancient inhabitants of the lands between celebrated this blending of forms, seeing it as a sacred connection to the primordial history of the world. This was a time of holistic existence, where the animal and the divine were recognized as parts of the same spectrum. The knights who served in the earliest days of the Erdtree, the Crucible Knights, still carry the evidence of this era in their combat styles and armor. They utilize aspects of the tail, the wings, and the horns, drawing upon the ancient currents of life that once flowed freely before Marika's order imposed a more specialized form. Their power is a remnant of a time when the Erdtree was not yet a golden monument, but a red-hued, sprawling mass of organic competition. They represent the bridge between the wild past and the structured present, wielding a strength that the Golden Order eventually found impossible to control. As the Greater Will began to exert its influence, the perception of the Crucible shifted from a source of holiness to a source of impurity. The features that were once considered blessed became known as the Omen Curse, and those born with the marks of the Crucible were hidden away, mutilated, or killed. Marika's new law demanded a world of clear distinctions and golden perfection, which had no room for the messy, blended history of the original tree. The Crucible was effectively demoted from a divine origin to a pagan relic, and its influence was systematically erased from the official records of the capital. The Crucible, nonetheless, remains the biological foundation of the lands between. It is the reason why the misbegotten and the omen continue to be born, as the ancient currents of life cannot be entirely suppressed by a golden decree. It represents the old power of the earth, a primal energy that predates the arrival of the Elden Beast. The red gold of the Crucible is the blood of the world, a thicker and more violent version of the grace that would later sustain the Erdtree. It is the memory of a time when life was a single, roaring flame, rather than a collection of separate embers. Ultimately, the primordial crucible proves that the Erdtree has a history that is far older than the Golden Order. Marika did not create the tree, she occupied it and specialized its function to serve her own ends. By looking back at the crucible, we see a world that was more inclusive of the monstrous and the wild. It was a time of terrifying beauty and unrestrained growth, a period where the pulse of the earth was loud and the distinction between a god and a beast was as thin as a single golden leaf. Before the Erdtree was imbued with the gold of the greater will, there existed the Greattree. This was the original terrestrial pillar of life that dominated the landscape of the ancient world. Its roots encompassed the entirety of the lands between, creating an underground network that served as the primary conduit for the recycling of souls and the distribution of vital energy. The Greattree was a natural phenomenon of the world, a biological anchor that connected the heavens to the earth, long before the arrival of the cosmic influence that would eventually transform it into a divine symbol. The roots of the Greattree were the foundation of the world's original cycle of life and death. In this era, when a living thing passed away, its essence was drawn into the roots and transported to the center of the tree to be processed and eventually reborn. This was a neutral, naturalistic system that did not favor one lineage over another. It was a biological recycling program that ensured the lands between remained fertile and populated. The Greattree did not demand worship or the exclusion of the impure. It simply functioned as the lung of the planet. When Marika ascended to godhood and established the Golden Order, she did not replace the Greattree with something entirely new. Instead, she performed a divine grafting, specializing the tree's functions to serve her specific vision of eternity. The Erdtree became the spiritual and legal face of the system, while the Greattree's roots remained as the physical infrastructure. This is why the catacombs of the modern era are built around the massive ancient roots of the underground. The Golden Order took over an existing plumbing system and placed a golden tap at the top. The relationship between the Greattree and the Erdtree is one of overlap and eventual tension. Over time, the golden grace of the Erdtree began to overwrite the more primitive, earthy nature of the Greattree. The ancient ways of root burial were co-opted into a religious duty to the Golden Order. However, the physical reality of the Greattree's roots remained a place where all manners of death washed up. This subterranean world was less concerned with Marika's laws and more concerned with the raw processing of organic matter, a fact that would eventually allow the corruption of Godwyn to spread so effectively. The Greattree also represents the era before the specialization of the soul. In the ancient world, and there was a sense that all life was part of the same great cycle, a theme that resonates with the history of the crucible. The Greattree was the physical structure that allowed that blending of life to exist in a stable form. It was a massive, silent witness to the rise and fall of civilizations like the Nox and the ancient dragons. It was the world's first divine symbol, a towering presence that proved the earth had its own power before any god arrived from the stars. The Greattree is the hidden history of the Erdtree. It is the sturdy, wooden heart inside the golden shell. By understanding the Greattree, we realize that the cycle of rebirth is not a unique gift of the Golden Order, but a fundamental law of the world that Marika simply claimed as her own. The deep roots that the Tarnished finds in every corner of the map are the remains of this ancient era, a reminder that no matter how much gold is painted on the surface, the world is still anchored by the ancient, dark wood of its first great pillar. The ancient dragons were the first true dynasty to rule over the lands between, establishing a civilization of staggering power and longevity long before the rise of humanity. These were not the wyverns or the lesser drakes seen in the modern era, but the four-winged, lightning-wielding titans of the prehistoric age. They possessed scales made of gravel stone, a material that granted them a form of biological immortality and made them virtually invulnerable to the passage of time. They were the masters of the sky and the first beings to be recognized as lords by the primal forces of the world. Their empire was centered in Farum Azula, a magnificent city of stone and storm that exists in a state of suspension outside the normal flow of time. From this high seat, the ancient dragons presided over a world that was still wild and unformed. Farum Azula was not just a fortress, it was a temple and a capital, the original seat of the Elden Ring, before it was moved to the capital city of Lendel. The dragons were the first keepers of the cosmic law, serving a god that preceded Marika and practicing a form of worship that was based on the majesty of the storm and the sky. The culture of the ancient dragons was defined by a stoic and eternal dignity. Because they did not fear death or aging, they built for a timeline that spanned millennia. Their architecture was designed to withstand the crumbling of continents, and their language was written in the very stones of their floating city. They viewed the younger races as transient and fleeting, seeing themselves as the permanent guardians of the world's order. To an ancient dragon, the Golden Order of Marika would have appeared as a brief and unstable flash of light compared to their own enduring reign. The power of the dragons was tied to the red lightning of the ancient sky. This was a primal, jagged energy that differed from the refined golden lightning later used by the knights of the capital. The dragons were the source of this power, and they used it to enforce their rule over the lesser creatures of the earth. Their lordship was one of absolute physical and spiritual dominance, rooted in the fact that they were the first beings to receive the Elden Ring and the grace of an outer god. They were the original chosen of the cosmos. However, the age of the dragons was not to last forever. A cosmic shift or a change in the favor of the greater will eventually led to the decline of their empire. Their god fled or was lost, leaving the dragons to preside over a city that was slowly crumbling into the sea of time. They became a lineage in waiting, guarding a vacant throne in a city that the rest of the world had forgotten. The ancient dragons shifted from being the active rulers of the world to being the silent, archaic remnants of a lost era. The ancient dragons represent the first peak of civilization in the lands between. They proved that a global order was possible, and they set the standard for what it meant to be an Elden Lord. Even after their defeat and the rise of the Erdtree, their influence remained in the form of the dragon cult and the respect they commanded from heroes like Godwyn. They are the elders of the world, the iron-winged titans who once held the fate of the planet in their gravel stone claws, ruling from a city that still floats as a monument to the first great age. Dragonlord Placidusax stands as the first Elden Lord in recorded history, a four-headed titan who ruled the lands between during the height of the Dragon Dynasty. He was the lordly counterpart to a god that is now lost to time, acting as the primary enforcer of the Elden Ring's laws, long before Marika or Godfrey were even conceived. Placidusax was a being of immense, world-shaping power, his very presence commanding the storms and the lightning of the ancient sky. He ruled from the center of Farum Azula, presiding over an age of stone and eternity that set the template for all lordship to follow. The reign of Placidusax was defined by a state of constant, stoic vigilance. Unlike the later lords who were often preoccupied with expansion and war, Placidusax was a guardian of a fixed and perfect order. However, this stability was shattered when his god, a vessel of the greater will similar to Marika, fled the lands between or was destroyed during a cosmic upheaval. This departure left Placidusax as a lord without a god, a ruler without a divine mandate. Instead of abandoning his post, the Dragonlord retreated to the Eye of the Storm in Farum Azula, where he entered a state of eternal waiting. When the Tarnished encounters Placidusax in the heart of the storm, he is a battered and wounded figure, having lost several of his heads in ancient battles that have been erased from human memory. He sits in a curled, meditative posture, suspended in a pocket of time where he endlessly awaits the return of his lost deity. This commitment to a vacant throne is a testament to the absolute loyalty of the ancient dragons. Placidusax is a lord of silence and stone, a being who refuses to accept that his age has passed and that a new order has taken his place. The existence of Placidusax proves that the title of Elden Lord is an ancient and cosmic office that predates the Golden Order. It is a role that exists independently of the Erdtree. By studying the Dragonlord, we see that the Greater Will has utilized different species and different systems to exert its influence over the planet throughout the eons. Placidusax was the first successful experiment in global governance, a being whose strength was so great that he could maintain a semblance of order even after the divine source of his power had vanished. His combat style is a masterclass in the primeval forces of the world. He utilizes golden breath and red lightning, as well as the ability to teleport through the clouds like a living storm. He is a warrior of the sky, his power rooted in the gravel stone and the ancient currents of the cosmos. To fight Placidusax is to experience the raw, unrefined strength of the world's first lord. He is a reminder that before there was gold, there was lightning, and before there was a tree, there was a dragon who held the world together with his claws. Dragonlord Placidusax is the tragic father of all lordship in the lands between. He is the standard of loyalty that every subsequent Elden Lord has failed to meet. He is still there, tucked away in the eye of the storm, waiting for a god who will never return. His story is a prologue to the tragedy of the Shattering, proving that even the most powerful and loyal lords can be abandoned by the celestial forces they serve. He is the first lord, the last of his kind, and the silent guardian of a history that the Golden Order has tried to bury under a layer of golden leaves. The Fire Giants were a race of massive, iron-skinned titans who inhabited the frozen peaks of the mountaintops of the giants. They were the sworn servants of the fell god, an ancient and malevolent deity whose one-eyed visage was manifested directly upon the chests of the giants. This deity provided the giants with the power of the Flame of Ruin, a primal and destructive force that could consume anything it touched. The Fire Giants were the guardians of the Forge, a colossal vessel of stone and fire that contained the only heat in the world capable of burning a world tree. The society of the Fire Giants was one of isolation and duty. They lived in the harshest environment in the lands between, far removed from the fertile plains of the Crucible or the cities of the dragons. Their existence was defined by the maintenance of the Forge, which they treated as a holy and terrifying responsibility. They understood that their fire was a threat to the very fabric of the world's order, and they stood as the silent, towering sentinels of the north, ensuring that the flame remained contained within its stone cauldron. The giants were not a race of mindless monsters, but a culture with its own traditions and language. They utilized massive, decorated shields and iron braids, and their bodies were built to endure the extreme cold of the peaks. Their connection to the fell god was a physical and inescapable bond, as the eye on their chest was said to be the literal eye of their god, watching the world through them. This made the giants a walking blasphemy in the eyes of the later Golden Order, as they carried the physical mark of a rival deity on their very skin. When Queen Marika began her rise to power, she identified the Fire Giants as the single greatest threat to her Erdtree. As long as the giants held the flame of ruin, the immortality of her golden tree was a lie. This led to a brutal and systematic war of extermination, led by Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. The Golden Army marched to the mountaintops and engaged in a genocidal campaign, slaughtering the giants until only one remained. This survivor was cursed to tend the forge for all eternity, a lone prisoner of the Golden Order who was forced to guard the very fire that had destroyed his people. The destruction of the fire giants was a pivotal moment in the establishment of the Golden Order. It removed the primary physical threat to the Erdtree and allowed Marika to claim a monopoly on divine power. However, the flame itself could not be extinguished. It remained in the forge, a lingering shadow that could be accessed by those with the will to burn the world. The giants may have been killed, but their god and their fire remained as a permanent, dormant threat to the Golden Age, waiting for a tarnished to climb the peaks. Ultimately, the fire giants are the martyrs of a lost age. They were a race of protectors who were branded as villains by a rising god. Their ruins, scattered across the mountaintops, are a testament to the scale of the war that Marika waged to secure her throne. They remind us that the Golden Order was built on the bones of those who were here before, and that the eternal age of the Erdtree was bought with the blood of the Titans who once held the key to its destruction. The Nox were an advanced and ancient civilization that built the magnificent eternal cities of Nokron and Noxtella deep beneath the surface of the lands between. They were a people of high culture and dark ambition, possessing a deep knowledge of the stars and the secrets of the Silver Tears. Unlike the surface dwellers who looked to the sun and the Erdtree, the Nox looked to the night sky and the moon. They sought to usher in an age of night, a world governed by the cold mysteries of the stars, rather than the golden warmth of the greater will. The architecture of the Nox was a masterclass in elegance and durability, featuring sprawling cathedrals and bridges made of obsidian and silver. They were masters of artifice. She's capable of creating sentient life in the form of the mimic tears, which could take the shape of any being they encountered. This mastery of biology and glintstone made the Nox one of the most powerful and sophisticated civilizations in the history of the world. They lived in a state of subterranean splendor, protected by the stone of the earth from the gaze of the heavens. The downfall of the Nox came when they openly defied the greater will by attempting to manufacture their own divinity. They sought to forge a Lord of Night, a being that would serve as their own counterpart to the Elden Lord. To achieve this, they created the Fingerslayer blade, a weapon forged from a corpse that was capable of harming the greater will's envoys, the Two Fingers. This was the ultimate blasphemy, a physical rejection of the cosmic order. In response, the greater will sent a celestial bolt, likely an Astel, natural born of the void, to crush their cities and banish the Nox forever. Following their banishment, the Nox were forced to remain in the shadows of the underground, waiting for a day that would never come. Their cities became stagnant mausoleums of a lost future. They were a people in waiting, their eyes fixed on the false sky they had built into the roofs of their caverns. They continued to practice their dark arts and protect their silver secrets, but their dream of an age of night was effectively buried under the weight of the Erdtree. They became the ghosts of the underground, a civilization of cold stone and forgotten ambition. The Nox represent the intellectual and rebellious peak of the old world. They were the first to realize that the greater will was an occupying force and the first to attempt to build a weapon against it. Their legacy remained in the form of the Black Knife assassins, who were said to be scions of the Nox. This connects the ancient underground civilization to the eventual murder of Godwyn, proving that the Nox's resentment of the Golden Order would eventually bear a bloody and world-shattering fruit. The Eternal Cities are a warning of the cost of defiance. They are the beautiful, cold ruins of a people who reached for the stars and were pulled back into the dirt. To walk through Nokron is to see a version of the world that might have been if the moon had won over the sun. The Nox were a people of the night who were forced to live in a permanent darkness, a civilization that was erased from the surface history but remained as a dark, silver heart beating beneath the roots of the Erdtree. The arrival of the Greater Will in the lands between was a cosmic event that fundamentally changed the trajectory of the world's history. It did not begin with a slow migration or a political treaty, but with a literal colonization of reality from the stars. The Greater Will sent a golden star into the lands between, a celestial vessel that carried the Elden Beast. This was the arrival of an outer god's influence in its most concentrated and physical form. The star crashed into the planet, bringing with it a new kind of energy and a new law that would eventually overwrite the chaotic vitality of the crucible. This golden star was the seed from which the Elden Ring and the Erdtree would grow. Before its arrival, the lands between were a place of disparate powers and competing lineages, from the ancient dragons to the fire giants. The Greater Will's intervention was an attempt to impose a singular, absolute order on this primal landscape. It sought to turn the planet into a vessel for its own divine logic, organizing life, death, and the very laws of physics into a system that it could control. This was the beginning of the Age of Gold, a transformation of the world into a garden for a celestial gardener. The arrival of the Elden Beast was a violent and transformative process. It did not seek to coexist with the existing powers. It sought to subjugate them. The Beast was the physical manifestation of the Elden Ring, a living totality of the cosmic order. As it took root in the world, it began to shape the environment to reflect its golden essence. This was the moment the primordial crucible began to be specialized and narrowed, as the wild blending of life was slowly organized into the rigid hierarchies of the Erdtree. The Greater Will was not a savior, it was an occupier. The impact of this event cannot be overstated. It introduced the concept of grace, a divine light that would eventually dictate who was worthy of life and who was cast out as tarnished. It created the office of the Elden Lord and the vessel of the god, establishing a religious and political structure that would last for millennia. The arrival of the star was the pivot point of the timeline, the moment the lands between moved from the era of naturalistic competition to the era of divine decree. However, the Greater Will's arrival also introduced a new kind of stagnation. By imposing a singular law, it removed the natural volatility of the world. The eternal age it promised was one of fixed positions and unchanging truths. This was a direct conflict with the inherent nature of the crucible, leading to the long and bloody wars that Marika would eventually have to fight to maintain the order. The Greater Will brought a golden peace, but it was a peace that required the systematic destruction of everything that came before it. The arrival of the Golden Star was the start of the game's central conflict. It was the moment the world was claimed by a power from beyond the stars. Every event that followed, from the war against the giants to the shattering of the ring, was a response to this original intervention. The greater will turned the lands between into its own laboratory, creating a world of immense beauty and immense sorrow, all governed by the golden laws of a creature that fell from the sky in a ball of fire. Part 9. The Elden Beast and the Elden Ring. The Elden Beast is the physical manifestation of the Elden Ring, sent to the lands between as the living embodiment of the greater will's law. It is not merely a creature that guards the ring, it is the ring itself, a cosmic entity of golden light and nebulous form that crashed into the world upon a falling star. As the beast integrated with the planet, it wove its essence into the fabric of reality, turning abstract concepts of divinity into a tangible set of rules. It became the totality of the world's fundamental principles, dictating how souls were processed, how light moved, and how life was granted or taken away. To control the Elden Ring is to hold the strings of the universe. When the beast became the ring, it established a system where the laws of physics were inseparable from the laws of theology. The great runes that make up the ring's geometry are the individual strands of this reality, governing everything from the passage of time to the weight of gravity. By anchoring itself within a divine vessel, the beast ensured that the lands between would function according to the singular vision of its celestial master. It was the transition from a world of natural chaos to a world of mathematical, golden precision. The biology of the beast reflects its alien origin, appearing as a vast, translucent organism filled with stars and constellations. It is a creature of the void that has draped itself in the gold of the Erdtree. Its presence ensured that the Elden Ring remained a sentient, reactive force rather than a static object. If the laws of the world were challenged, the beast possessed the power to enforce them through overwhelming celestial force. It served as the final arbiter of the greater will's influence, a silent and terrifying god that lurked at the heart of the world tree. The establishment of the ring also meant the establishment of a hierarchy that the planet had never seen. The beast required a vessel, a god, and a lord to act as its hands. This created a pyramid of power that placed the cosmic entity at the apex, followed by the Empyreans and the Elden Lords. This structure was designed to be unbreakable, a cycle of renewal and order that would prevent the world from ever returning to the wild blending of the crucible. The Elden Ring was the cage in which the greater will locked the natural world, she ensuring that all growth happened within the confines of its golden geometry. Over the centuries, the Elden Beast became synonymous with the Erdtree itself, the two entities fusing into a singular symbol of divine authority. The golden light that bathed the lands between was the radiation of the beast's power, a constant reminder that the world was being watched and governed by a force from beyond the stars. It was a beautiful and terrifying occupation. The beast did not care for the individual lives of those it ruled. It cared only for the maintenance of the order. It was a cold, cosmic machine, disguised as a graceful, golden deity. The internal logic of the Elden Ring became the absolute truth of the lands between, making any rebellion against it an act of metaphysical heresy. To break the ring was to break the world, a fact that Marika would eventually use as her final weapon. The beast remained the silent passenger within the god vessel, a parasite of light that provided the power for a kingdom, while simultaneously draining the world of its original, primordial agency. It was the golden law made flesh, a star-born monster that became the foundation of everything humanity thought it knew about the divine. Part 10. The Gloam-Eyed Queen. Before Marika ascended to her position as the sole god of the Erdtree, the Two Fingers had chosen another Empyrean to lead the world, the Gloam-Eyed Queen. She was a figure of immense and terrifying power, serving as the matron of the Godskin Apostles. While Marika would eventually represent life and the eternal nature of the Erdtree, the Gloam-Eyed Queen represented the finality of the grave. She wielded the power of the Black Flame, a dark and flickering energy that was specifically designed to slay the divine. She was a rival for the throne of the lands between, a shadow queen who threatened the very concept of a golden age. The Godskin Apostles who followed her were the physical evidence of her heresy. They were warriors who donned the literal skins of the gods they had slaughtered, a ritualistic display of their queen's god-slaying potential. They moved with a serpentine grace, their bodies warped by the influence of the Black Flame and the dark rituals of their order. The Gloam-Eyed Queen did not seek to preserve the demigods. She sought to harvest them. She was the leader of a cult of deicide, a woman who believed that the only way to establish a new order was to burn the old one to ash. The Black Flame, she commanded, was a primal force of destined death. Unlike the golden light of the Erdtree, which promised a return to the roots, the Black Flame offered a complete and total ending. It was a weapon that could bypass the immortality of the Empyreans, making the Gloam-Eyed Queen the most dangerous individual in the history of the pre-Golden Order era. She was the one obstacle that Marika could not overcome through diplomacy or simple warfare. She was a competitor for the greater will's favor, a different vision of what the Elden Ring should represent. The conflict between the two Empyreans was resolved when Marika dispatched her shadow, Maliketh the Black Blade, to deal with the threat. Maliketh was a beast of unparalleled ferocity. She and he engaged the Gloam-Eyed Queen in a battle that would decide the fate of death itself. Maliketh emerged victorious, defeating the queen and stripping her of her power. He took the source of her black flame, the rune of death, and sealed it away within his own blade. This victory effectively ended the age of the Godskins and paved the way for Marika's monopoly on divinity. Following her defeat, the Gloam-Eyed Queen vanished from the official records of the Golden Order, her name becoming a footnote in a history written by the victors. Her godskin apostles were scattered to the corners of the world, lurking in shadows and ancient temples, waiting for a queen who would never return. The black flame lost its god-slaying potency once the rune of death was sealed, becoming a mere shadow of its former self. Marika had removed her greatest rival, and in doing so, she had removed the threat of death from her family's future. The history of the Gloam-Eyed Queen serves as a reminder that Marika's rise was not an inevitable divine right, but a conquest. There was another path the world could have taken, a darker and more final order governed by the woman with the gloam-coloured eyes. By defeating her, Maliketh ensured that the Erdtree would be a place of life, but he also ensured that the world would become stagnant. The Queen of the Godskins was the last person who could have enforced a natural end to the gods, and her disappearance was the first step toward the eternal, unchanging nightmare of Marika's reign. Section 3. The Rise of Marika. Part 11. Marika's Ascension. Marika was not born as a goddess, but as a shaman girl from a small village in the land of shadow. Her early life was defined by the horrific jar rituals of the Hornsent, a civilization that viewed her people as raw material for their own twisted pursuit of divinity. The Hornsent would mutilate shaman women, stuffing them into jars with other corpses in an attempt to create a saint. Marika was a survivor of this biological nightmare, a witness to the total degradation of her kind. Her ascension was born out of a desire for absolute power and a burning, vengeful need. to ensure that her people would never be victims again. To claim her godhood, Marika travelled to Enirilim and ascended the Gate of Divinity, a colossal structure built from the corpses of countless sacrifices. It was here, at the threshold between the mortal and the cosmic, that she made her pact with the greater will. She reached into a bloody, unidentifiable source, likely the remains of a defeated rival or a sacrificial god, and pulled forth the golden threads of the Elden Ring. This was the moment of her transformation, the point where she ceased to be a shaman and became Marika the Eternal, the vessel for a new world order. The ascension was an act of supreme will and supreme violence. Marika did not just step into a vacant role. She seized it by weaving the first threads of the Erdtree from the gore of the old world. This original sin is what would eventually haunt her lineage. She built her paradise upon a foundation of blood, using the power she gained at the gate to begin the systematic removal of everyone who had once oppressed her. Her first act as a god was to create a world where she was the only one capable of defining what was holy and what was profane. Her ascent marked the end of the age of the crucible and the beginning of the age of the Erdtree. She took the wild, blended life force of the world and specialized it, turning the red-hued tree into a monument of gold. She was a master of self-reinvention, discarding her past and her trauma to project an image of perfect, untouchable divinity. She became the mother of a new age, but the gold she wielded was always stained by the blood of the gate. She was a goddess born of a jar, a survivor who became the ultimate oppressor to ensure her own survival. The Gate of Divinity remains as a silent witness to this transition, a place where the boundary between life and death was blurred to birth a god. Marika's rise was the catalyst for the systematic purging of the Hornsent and the veiling of her original homeland. She sought to hide the messy, horrific origins of her power, creating a narrative where the Erdtree had always been the source of all grace. But the roots of her tree were always anchored in the graves of Enirilim, a fact that would eventually lead to the fracturing of her mind and her order. The story of Marika's ascension is the story of a victim who became a god to escape her pain. She achieved the ultimate goal of any Empyrean, but she did so by sacrificing her humanity and the humanity of everyone around her. She became the Eternal, a being who could not die and could not be challenged, ruling over a world that was as beautiful as it was artificial. She had escaped the jars of the Hornsent, but she had built a golden jar of her own, one that would eventually hold the entire world captive until the day the Elden Ring was shattered. Part 12. The First Golden Order. With the Elden Ring firmly within her grasp, Marika established the First Golden Order, a system of law and faith that redefined existence in the lands between. The central tenet of this new world was the absolute supremacy of the Erdtree, described as great and all-encompassing. This was not just a religious statement, it was a biological and political decree. Marika sought to align the very nature of life with her golden light, ensuring that every soul was a subject of her tree. The First Golden Order was an age of expansion and specialization, where the chaotic influence of the crucible was finally tamed. However, the all-encompassing nature of the order was built on a foundation of absolute exclusion. To define what was golden and pure, Marika had to define what was impure and unworthy of grace. This led to the systematic persecution of any life form that still carried the marks of the old world. The Hornsent, who had once tormented her people, were hunted to near extinction. The misbegotten, the omen, and those who bore the horns and tails of the crucible were branded as cursed and cast out of society. The first Golden Order was a world of high walls and deep shadows, where perfection was maintained through the removal of the different. Marika's order also introduced the concept of grace, a literal golden light that guided the chosen and blinded the rejected. This light served as a social and spiritual currency, dictating one's place in the hierarchy of Leyndell. The Erdtree became the physical manifestation of this grace, a towering monument that could be seen from every corner of the world. It was a time of immense prosperity for those within Marika's favor, as the world was organized into a functioning, divine empire. The law was absolute, and the goddess was the living vessel of that law. The first Golden Order was also the age of the first Elden Lord, Godfrey. While Marika provided the spiritual and legal framework, Godfrey provided the muscle. Together, they forged a kingdom through fire and sword, bringing the disparate regions of the lands between under the singular banner of the Erdtree. This era was characterized by a sense of divine purpose, as the golden lineage began to populate the world. It was the Golden Age in its most literal sense, a period of construction and conquest that sought to erase the memory of the crucible forever. This was also the period when the Church of the Erdtree was established, a religious institution designed to propagate Marika's divinity. The faith was built on the idea that the Erdtree was the beginning and end of all things. The natural cycles of the Greattree were replaced by the order of the Erdtree, where death was no longer a natural conclusion, but a return to the goddess. The first Golden Order was a masterpiece of control, a system that managed to turn the very act of existing into a form of worship toward Marika. Despite its outward brilliance, the first Golden Order contained the seeds of its own destruction. By basing her law on the exclusion of the impure, Marika created a world of resentment and hidden truths. The Order was a rigid structure that could not adapt to change, relying entirely on the perfection of its goddess. It was a world of gold painted over a world of blood, and the tension between the two would eventually cause the first cracks to appear. The first Golden Order was the peak of Marika's ambition, a golden age that was bought with a price the world is still paying. Part 13. Godfrey becomes the first Elden Lord. To secure her reign over a world that was still filled with rival powers and ancient gods, Marika required a consort who could serve as her primary weapon. She chose the chieftain of the bloodthirsty Badlands warriors, a man named Huaralu. In a political and divine union that would define the era, Marika wed the chieftain and granted him the name Godfrey, elevating him to the position of the first Elden Lord. This was more than a marriage. It was the merging of Marika's divine grace with Godfrey's raw terrestrial strength. He became the physical enforcer of the Golden Order, the lion of the battlefield who would conquer the world in her name. Godfrey was the personification of the warrior spirit, to temper his insatiable lust for battle and make him a fit lord for a golden age. A spectral lion named Serosh was grafted onto his back. Serosh served as a literal weight upon Godfrey's soul, suppressing his bloodlust and forcing him to act with the dignity and restraint expected of a monarch. This transformed the savage chieftain into a regal lord, a man who could lead an army with the same precision that Marika used to lead a church. He was the perfect counterpart to the goddess, the iron fist within the golden glove. As the first Elden Lord, Godfrey led the Golden Army on a long march of conquest that spanned the entire continent. He was the one who broke the backs of the ancient tribes and the rival kings who refused to bow to the Erdtree. His strength was legendary, and his presence on the battlefield was enough to turn the tide of any conflict. He fought not for his own glory, but out of a deep and abiding loyalty to Marika and the order she had built. He was the anchor of the Golden lineage, the father of Godwyn and the Omen twins, and the man who made the Erdtree's supremacy a physical reality. Godfrey's lordship was characterized by a sense of honorable combat. He respected strength in his enemies and led his warriors with a code of conduct that became the standard for the Knights of Leyndell. He was a lord of the people, a man who was loved by his soldiers and feared by his foes. Under his leadership, the Golden Order expanded until there were no worthy foes left to challenge the Erdtree. He was the hero of the age, the man who had tamed a planet so that Marika could rule it in peace. The union of Marika and Godfrey was the foundation of the Golden Order's first phase. It established the tradition that the god vessel required a consort to act as the Elden Lord, a dual system of power that balanced the spiritual with the martial. Godfrey provided the stability that allowed the Erdtree to grow, protecting the sapling tree from the fire and the storm. He was the war council who ensured that the early days of the Order were defined by victory rather than compromise. He was the first and perhaps the greatest of the lords, a man whose name was synonymous with the strength of the gold. However, Godfrey's role was always tied to the existence of an enemy. He was a creature of war, and his purpose was defined by the struggle against the outer world. Marika had chosen him for his strength, but that same strength would eventually become a liability once the wars were over. Godfrey was a lord built for the foundation of an empire, not for its maintenance. As he stood atop the corpses of his final enemies, he did not realize that his service to the goddess was nearing its end, and that the grace he had fought so hard to defend was about to be taken away. Part 14. The War Against the Fire Giants. The most significant military campaign of Godfrey's career was the War Against the Fire Giants. This was not a battle for territory or resources, but a defensive crusade intended to protect the very existence of the Erdtree. Marika knew that the flame of ruin, guarded by the giants on their northern peaks, was the only force capable of burning her tree and ending her age. To ensure the eternal nature of her order, the giants had to be neutralized. Godfrey led the Golden Army into the frozen heights, embarking on a brutal war of attrition against the iron-skinned titans and the power of their fell god. The war was a horrific display of the Golden Order's overwhelming power. The giants, despite their massive size and their command over the fire, Ferns were systematically outmaneuvered and slaughtered by Godfrey's elite warriors. The first Elden Lord himself fought at the front of the lines, his axe cleaving through the giants as he ascended the peaks. It was a war of extinction, where the mercy of the Golden Order was nowhere to be found. Marika had decreed that the flame must be quenched, and Godfrey carried out that decree with a terrifying efficiency, leaving the mountaintops a graveyard of titans. The climax of the war occurred at the Forge of the Giants, where the last remnants of the giant race made their final stand. The fire they wielded was a primal, destructive force that scorched the sky, but it could not overcome the combined grace of Marika and the strength of Godfrey. The fell god, manifesting through the eye on the chest of the last giant, was defeated, its influence suppressed by the triumph of the gold. This victory ensured that the Erdtree was safe from the fire, but it left a permanent, bloody scar on the history of the North. Following the slaughter, Marika realized that the flame of ruin could never truly be extinguished. Even with the giants dead, the fire remained in the forge as a lingering threat. In an act of divine cruelty, she cursed the last surviving giant to tend the flame for all eternity, forcing him to act as the eternal guardian of the very fire that had destroyed his kind. This ensured that the flame would remain contained, and that no one else could use it to threaten her tree. The last giant became a living monument to Godfrey's victory and Marika's ruthlessness. The war against the fire giants was the moment the Golden Order moved from a rising power to an absolute one. By removing the giants, Godfrey had removed the only physical counter to the Erdtree's divinity. This allowed the Golden Order to claim that its age was indeed eternal, as the only weapon capable of ending it was now under lock and key. The mountains were abandoned to the snow and the ghosts, and the Golden Army returned to Leyndell in triumph, having secured the future of the Erdtree through the total destruction of its greatest rival. This campaign also marked the beginning of the end for Godfrey's purpose. With the giants defeated, there were no more world-threatening foes left for him to conquer. He had performed the ultimate service for his queen, but in doing so, he had made himself obsolete. The War Council was no longer needed in a world of peace. The blood of the giants was the last great offering Godfrey would make to the Erdtree, and as he looked out from the snowy peaks toward the golden capital, the grace in his eyes began to dim, signaling the end of the age of conquest. Part 15. The War Against the Dragons. The War Against the Dragons was a conflict that began when the ancient dragon Fortisax and his kin launched a direct assault on the capital city of Leyndell. This was the first time the walls of the Golden City had ever been breached, and the sight of the massive lightning-wielding drakes hovering over the Erdtree sent a shockwave of fear through the heart of the Order. The ancient dragons were seeking to reclaim their status as the rightful lords of the world, and they proved to be a far more formidable foe than the giants or the mountain tribes. The war was a clash of two different eras of divinity, the red lightning of the past against the gold of the present. The turning point of the war came through the actions of Marika's firstborn son, Godwyn the Golden. While Godfrey had built the empire through slaughter, Godwyn would secure it through a combination of strength and diplomacy. During a climactic battle, Godwyn engaged the mighty Fortisax in single combat. Instead of delivering a final, killing blow to the defeated dragon, Godwyn chose to spare him. He recognized the nobility in his opponent and offered him his hand in friendship. This act of mercy was unprecedented in the history of the Golden Order, and it changed the course of the war instantly. The friendship between Godwyn and Fortisax birthed the ancient dragon cult within the capital. This was a unique religious and military alliance where the dragons were integrated into the defense of the Erdtree rather than being exterminated. The knights of Leyndell began to study the ancient lightning of the dragons, learning to wield a refined version of the power that had once threatened to destroy them. This golden lightning became a signature weapon of the capital's elite, turning the former enemies into the most loyal protectors of the Golden Order. This war proved that the Golden Order could expand through diplomacy and mutual respect, not just bloody conquest. Godwyn's ability to turn a potential apocalypse into an alliance was a testament to his charisma and his vision for the world. He understood that the ancient dragons were a bridge to the primordial history of the world, and that their power was worth preserving. Under his influence, the capital became a place where different eras of divinity could coexist, making the Golden Order feel more all-encompassing than ever before. The integration of the dragons also provided the Golden Order with a powerful air force and a connection to the prehistoric age. The dragon cult became a respected pillar of the city's faith, and the presence of the dragons in the sky above Leyndell was a sign of the Order's absolute supremacy. Godwyn had achieved a victory that was even more significant than Godfrey's slaughter of the giants. He had annexed the past and made it a part of his mother's future. He was the hero of the capital, the Golden Prince who had brought peace to the sky. However, this war also highlighted the growing divide between the methods of the first generation. While Godfrey remained a man of the axe and the Badlands, Godwyn was a man of the capital and the court. The warrior age was beginning to transition into the Golden Age, where politics and cults were just as important as the battlefield. The victory over the dragons was the final high water mark of the early Golden Order, a period of unity and strength that would never be repeated. Godwyn had secured the city, but the shadows of the conspiracy that would eventually take his life were already beginning to gather. Section 16, The Order, expands. Part 16, The Liurnian Wars. The expansion of the Golden Order eventually brought Marika's influence to the borders of Liurnia of the Lakes, in the domain of the Carian royal family and the Academy of Raya Lucaria. Unlike the giants or the dragons, the Carians possessed a mastery of sorcery and the power of the moon that proved to be a perfect counter to the Erdtree's grace. Two major wars were fought between the Golden Army and the Liurnian forces, and for the first time in her history, Marika found herself unable to achieve a total military victory. The Academy's magic and the Carian knight's skill turned the battlefield into a bloody stalemate that threatened to drain the resources of the capital. The resolution to this conflict came through a political masterstroke that would forever alter the royal family tree. A champion of the Golden Order named Radagon, a man with striking red hair and a mysterious origin, led the second campaign into Liurnia. Instead of continuing the slaughter, Radagon met with Queen Rennala, the head of the Carian royals, on the battlefield. In a shocking move that bypassed the need for further bloodshed, the two leaders chose to wed, uniting the golden light of the Erdtree with the silver light of the moon. This was not a surrender, but a merger of two of the most powerful houses in the world. The marriage of Radagon and Rennala was a political triumph for the Golden Order. It effectively absorbed the power of Liurnia and its sorcery into the golden lineage without the need for a total extermination. This union produced three significant children: Radan, Rykard, and Ranni. These stepchildren of the Erdtree would later be elevated to the status of demigods, bringing the intellectual and magical heritage of the Carians into the heart of Leyndell. The Liurnian Wars ended with a peaceful alliance that made the Golden Order feel more diverse and unstoppable than ever before. During this period, Radagon lived in the Raya Lucaria Academy, studying the secrets of sorcery while maintaining his loyalty to the Golden Order. He became a bridge between the two conflicting ideologies, attempting to find a fundamental unity between the laws of the stars and the laws of the gold. This intellectual pursuit would eventually define his character as a fundamentalist, a man who sought to understand the very fabric of reality. The marriage was a time of relative peace and intellectual flourishing, as the two great powers of the lands between worked together to govern the continent. However, the nature of Radagon himself remained a source of mystery and hidden tension. While he appeared to be a champion of the Order, his connection to Marika was far deeper and more complex than anyone suspected. The marriage to Rennala was a functional tool for the expansion of the Order, a way to neutralize a rival through love rather than war. But as the needs of the Golden Order shifted, so too would Radagon's loyalties. The masterstroke of the Liurnian marriage was built on a foundation of secrecy that would eventually lead to the heartbreaking abandonment of Rennala and the fracturing of the family. Ultimately, the Liurnian Wars represent the moment the Golden Order moved away from pure conquest and towards sophisticated political integration. Marika had realized that some powers were better absorbed than destroyed. The union of the Erdtree and the moon was the peak of the Order's diplomatic success, creating a family of demigods who possessed the strength of Godfrey and the wisdom of the Carians. But this expansion had also introduced new, ambitious voices into the royal line. Voices like Ranni's, which would eventually lead to the collapse of the very order they were meant to sustain. Part 17. The Removal of Death. To finalize her vision of an eternal kingdom, Marika performed the most significant metaphysical alteration in the history of the lands between by plucking the Rune of Death from the Elden Ring. This act fundamentally rewrote the laws of nature, separating the concept of a natural ending from the cycle of existence. By removing Destined Death, Marika ensured that her subjects would no longer pass away in the traditional sense. Instead, their souls and bodies were tethered to the Erdtree, creating a system where life was persistent and the grave was replaced by a return to the golden roots for eventual rebirth. This removal was the foundational act of the Golden Order's second phase, transforming the world into a realm of immortality. Marika entrusted the stolen rune to her shadow, Malekith the Black Blade, who sealed the power of death within his own flesh and his legendary sword. This ensured that Marika held a total monopoly on the end of life. Only she and her shadow possessed the means to truly kill a god or a demigod. The world became a fixed point in time, a stagnant paradise where the fear of the final transition was replaced by the comfort of the Erdtree's eternal grace. The consequences for the physical world were immediate and profound. Without the presence of death, the natural decay of the land slowed to a crawl, and the cycle of the Greattree was fully specialized into Marika's Erdtree. People who would have normally died of old age or injury were instead preserved, their essence lingering until they were called back to the roots of the capital. This created a society that viewed death as a forgotten myth or a distant heresy, a culture that predicated its entire identity on the fact that the goddess had conquered the final enemy of humanity. However, this immortality came with a heavy cost to the spiritual health of the planet. By sealing away death, Marika had also sealed away the possibility of true renewal. The world began to fill with those who had lived for centuries, their minds and spirits growing weary under the weight of an endless afternoon. The Order became a closed system, unable to shed its old layers to make room for the new. The removal of the rune was a desperate attempt to freeze the world in a state of golden perfection, but it inadvertently created a landscape where nothing could ever truly change or evolve. Malekith became the grim jailer of the world's ending, a figure of absolute dread who lurked in the shadows as a reminder of what had been lost. He was the only one who still carried the burden of knowing what death was, a secret that weighed heavily on his beastly soul. The Rune of Death was the skeleton in the closet of the Golden Order, a jagged, dark fragment of reality that was hidden beneath a layer of golden lore. As long as it remained sealed, the demigods were safe, but the world was denied the natural rhythm of the seasons and the peace of a final rest. The act of plucking the rune also marked Marika's final break from the naturalistic ways of the crucible and the Greattree. She had moved beyond being a mere ruler and had become the arbiter of reality itself. By choosing who lived forever and who was denied a death, she exerted a control that was absolute and terrifying. This was the moment the Erdtree became a spiritual prison as much as a source of life, a golden cage that kept the world from following its own biological impulses toward a conclusion. The removal of death was the ultimate triumph of the gold, but it was also the first step toward the universal stagnation that would eventually lead to the Shattering. Part 18. Godfrey's Banishment. Once the final worthy foe was defeated atop the mountaintops and the ancient dragons were brought into the fold, the purpose of the first Elden Lord reached its conclusion. Godfrey was a creature of war, a man whose entire existence was defined by the struggle against the outer world. In the new era of peace and religious rigidity that Marika sought to establish, a savage warrior lord was no longer a suitable consort. In a shocking and cold display of divine authority, Marika stripped the grace from Godfrey and his loyal warriors, plunging the gold from their eyes and leaving them faded and lost. This was the birth of the Tarnished. Marika did not merely exile Godfrey. She fundamentally altered his nature and the nature of his kin, removing their connection to the Erdtree's light. She commanded them to leave the lands between and travel to the distant Badlands, where they were to live, fight, and die as mortals outside the influence of the Elden Ring. This was a calculated move to preserve a warrior caste in a state of raw, terrestrial struggle, away from the softening influence of the capital. Marika was essentially placing her best soldiers in cold storage, preparing them for a day when she might need their strength to break the very order she had built. Godfrey accepted his banishment with the same stoic honor that had defined his lordship. He took up his old name, Huara Lu, and led his people across the fog and into the unknown. He did not rebel or curse the goddess who had discarded him. He followed the commands of his queen with a devastating loyalty. The loss of the first Elden Lord marked the end of the warrior age of the Golden Order. The lion was sent back to the wilds, and the capital of Leyndell transitioned into a city of scholars and priests who had never tasted the blood of a battlefield. The departure of the Tarnished left a void in the social fabric of the world. Those who remained behind began to view the grace-stripped warriors as outcasts and pariahs, a perspective that would persist for generations. Marika had successfully purged the savage elements from her kingdom, but she had also removed the only person who was her physical equal. The Golden Order became more refined, more theological, and more isolated. The memory of the chieftain who had conquered the giants was suppressed, replaced by the rising influence of the fundamentalists and the new academic lordship of Radagon. The exile served a secret, deeper purpose that only Marika fully understood. By sending Godfrey away to grow strong through death and hardship, she was creating a failsafe against the stagnation of the greater will. She knew that a day might come when the gold would need to be challenged by the iron. The Tarnished were her contingency plan, a splintered army of the discarded who would one day be recalled by the very grace that had been taken from them. Godfrey's march into the Badlands was the first movement in a long-game conspiracy that Marika was weaving against her own divinity. The sight of the first Elden Lord walking away from the golden walls of the capital is one of the most poignant images in the history of the world. It was the moment the Golden Order lost its heart and kept only its law. Godfrey became a ghost of the past, a legendary figure whose return was prophesied but feared. He left behind a lineage of demigods who would struggle to live up to his martial legacy, and a goddess who was now alone in her palace, free to begin the next, more intellectual phase of her eternal reign. The warrior had done his job, and the age of the fundamentalists was about to begin. Part 19. Radagon as second Elden Lord. Following the banishment of Godfrey, the enigmatic champion, Radagon left his wife Rennala and the Academy of Raya Lucaria to return to the capital and take his place as the second Elden Lord. This transition marked a significant shift in the tone of the Golden Order. moving away from the martial conquest of the Badlands and toward a period of rigid religious fundamentalism. Radagon was not a warrior king in the mold of Godfrey. He was a scholar of the law and a master of the ring's internal logic. He sought to understand the Golden Order as a perfect mathematical truth, emphasizing the study of the stars and the gold as parts of a unified whole. Radagon's reign as Elden Lord was characterized by a period of intense theological standardization. He introduced the Golden Order fundamentalism, a school of thought that utilized intelligence and faith to dissect the laws of the universe. Under his guidance, the Church became a place of rigorous study, focusing on the principles of regression and causality, the ideas that all things yearn to be joined and that all things have a consequence. This was the academic age of the Erdtree, where the wild, organic history of the world was codified into a set of unyielding, divine equations. The arrival of Radagon at Marika's side also solidified the secrecy surrounding their true nature. While the public saw them as a divine couple, they were in fact two aspects of the same being. She a dual-natured god vessel that could manifest as either the female goddess or the male lord. This internal duality allowed the Golden Order to represent both the governing law and the divine grace simultaneously. Radagon's presence in Leyndell was the ultimate consolidation of power, ensuring that there was no longer any distinction between the crown and the church. He was the perfect enforcer for a system that demanded absolute intellectual and spiritual conformity. The children of Radagon and Rennala, Radon, Rykard and Ranni, were elevated to the status of demigods, becoming the new pillars of the royal family. They brought the Carian influence into the heart of the order, further expanding the intellectual reach of Marika's reign. Radagon's influence ensured that the next generation of demigods was as focused on the laws of the world as they were on their own power. It was a time of immense cultural and religious pride, as the capital city reached the height of its architectural and spiritual splendor under the guidance of the Second Lord. The rigid nature of Radagon's fundamentalism eventually created a world that was brittle and resistant to change. By treating the Golden Order as a perfect, unchanging machine, he removed the flexibility that had allowed the early order to survive. Any deviation from the Golden Law was treated as a mathematical error that needed to be corrected. This created a tension between the law of Radagon and the will of Marika, as the goddess began to harbor doubts that her consort did not share. Radagon was a lord of the status quo, a man who would fight to the death to preserve the ring exactly as it was. The shift to Radagon's lordship was the moment the Golden Order became a true dogma. The axe was replaced by the telescope and the prayer book. While the world appeared to be at its most stable, it was also at its most stagnant. The fundamentalists were so focused on the perfection of the gold that they failed to see the rot beginning to fester at the roots of the tree. Radagon was the champion of a world that refused to look at its own history, a lord who believed that logic could suppress the chaos of the crucible. His era was the brilliant, golden afternoon of the world, unaware that the sun was already beginning to set on the horizon. Part 20, Messmer's Crusade. Hidden away from the official histories of the lands between was Marika's most brutal and secret military campaign, the Crusade of Messmer the Impaler. After ascending to godhood, Marika did not forget the shaman villages and the horrific jar rituals of the Hornsen. She sent her son, Messmer, a figure of terrifying power who bore a strange, serpentine curse, to her original homeland in the Land of Shadow. His mission was one of absolute purification through fire, a genocidal war intended to purge the Haunsant and erase the memory of Marika's traumatic past. Messmer was the dark scalpel used to cut away the parts of the world that the Golden Order refused to acknowledge. The crusade was a campaign of unprecedented violence. As Messmer and his army of fire-wielding knights laid waste to the towers and temples of the Shadow Realm, Messmer utilized an abyssal, flickering flame that was far more destructive than the standard pyromancies of the surface, impaling his enemies on massive spears and burning their cities to ash. This was a war of vengeance, a mother's trauma manifested through a son's absolute loyalty. Messmer did not fight for glory or territory. He fought to fulfill a divine decree of erasure, acting as the shadow executioner for a goddess who wanted to be eternal without a history. The land of shadow became a scorched graveyard under Messmer's watch. He built the Shadow Keep as his base of operations, presiding over a realm where all manners of death wash up. He became the jailer of the discarded, the man who stayed behind to ensure that the secrets of the jar rituals and the gate of divinity were never spoken of again. Messmer was the child Marika could not show to the world, a demigod who carried the base serpent within him, a curse that mirrored the very impurity the Golden Order sought to exclude. He was the living embodiment of the Order's hidden hypocrisy. The crusade reached its conclusion when Marika performed a final act of divine concealment. She placed a veil over the entire land of shadow, physically and spiritually separating it from the rest of the lands between. The region and the sun she had sent to purge it were effectively erased from the record of the Erdtree. Messmer was left in the dark, abandoned by the mother he had served so faithfully. He forced to continue his crusade against a people who were already broken. He became a ghost of the Golden Order, a commander of a forgotten war who waited centuries for a sign from the goddess that would never come. The secret of Messmer's crusade is the original sin of the Golden Order. It proves that the peace of the Erdtree was bought through the systematic slaughter of an entire civilization. Marika's godhood was not a gift to the world, but a shield for herself, and Messmer was the one who held that shield in the dark. The existence of the Impaler and his army of fire is a testament to the lengths Marika would go to protect her image of perfection. She had turned her own homeland into a prison and her own son into a monster to ensure that the gold remained untainted by the memory of the shadow. The land of shadow remains as a stagnant, decaying mirror to the lands between, a place where the logic of the Golden Order does not apply. Messmer sits on his throne in the dark, still impaling the enemies of a mother who has forgotten him. His crusade is the pulse of resentment that beats beneath the roots of the Erdtree, a reminder that the world's history is written in blood, that the gold can never truly wash away. Messmer is the tragic evidence of Marika's ruthlessness, a son who burned a world for a goddess, who chose to bury him in the silence of the veil. Section 5. The Cracks Form. Part 21. Miquella and the Haligtree. As the stagnation of the Golden Order became apparent to the younger generation of demigods, the Empyrean Miquella began to seek a path that the fundamentalism of his father, Radagon, could not provide. Miquella was born with a curse of eternal childhood, while his twin sister, Malenia, was afflicted with the Scarlet Rot. Despite his vast intelligence and his mastery of Golden Order principles, Miquella found that the Erdtree's grace was unable to cure his sister's decay or his own stagnation. This realization led him to abandon the Golden Order entirely, viewing it as a failed system that offered no true salvation for the unwanted or the cursed. Miquella's rebellion was an act of biological and spiritual innovation. He sought to create a new source of divinity, a Haligtree that would be grown outside the influence of the greater will. He took a sapling and watered it with his own blood, attempting to foster a tree that would offer a haven for the misbegotten, the Albinorics, and all those cast out by Marika's law. The Haligtree was a monument to Miquella's compassion and his ambition to become a god of a kinder, more inclusive order. It was a direct challenge to the supremacy of the Erdtree, a rival sun rising in the frozen north. The construction of the Haligtree was a massive undertaking that drew the loyalty of those who felt abandoned by the gold. Miquella utilized unalloyed gold to ward off the influence of outer gods, specifically the god of rot that plagued his sister. He sought to create a space where life could flourish without the interference of celestial entities. However, the tree was never able to reach its full potential. It remained stunted and twisted, a reflection of Miquella's own unfinished state. He had the vision of a new world, but he lacked the physical maturity to see it through to completion. Miquella's disappearance into the roots of the Haligtree was intended to be a period of chrysalis, a transformative sleep that would allow him to emerge as a full-grown god. He placed himself within a cocoon, intending to merge his essence with the tree and finally heal the world. But this plan was shattered when he was kidnapped by his half-brother Mog, who tore the cocoon from the roots and took the Empyrean to the subterranean blood swamps. This act of violence left the Haligtree a dying husk, and millennia a broken guardian, waiting for a brother who would never return to the light. The failure of the Haligtree was the first major fracture in the stability of the royal family. It proved that the demigods were no longer unified under the banner of the Erdtree, and that the most gifted among them were seeking to build their own empires. Miquella's departure was a devastating blow to the Golden Order, as he was the only one capable of offering a legitimate alternative to Marika's law. He had sought to be a savior, but his journey into the dark had only added to the growing chaos of the age. The legacy of Miquella is one of tragic potential. He was the most fearsome Empyrean, not because of his martial strength, but because of his ability to compel affection and build a vision of a better world. His Haligtree remains as a beautiful, rotting graveyard of a dream that was never realized. Miquella's attempt to fix the world by abandoning his father's fundamentalism was the sign that the Golden Order was no longer capable of holding the hearts of its children. The cracks in the foundation were widening, and the light of the Erdtree was beginning to feel more like a weight than a blessing. Part 22. Ranni and the Two Fingers. While Miquella sought to build a new tree, his sister-in-law, Ranni, the Empyrean, was planning a more absolute rebellion against the cosmic order. As a child of Rennala and Radagon, Ranni had been chosen by the Two Fingers to be a candidate for godhood, a potential successor to Queen Marika. To the greater will, Ranni was a prize, a vessel that would carry on the Golden Order under the guidance of the celestial stars. But Ranni refused to be a puppet. She viewed the Two Fingers as controlling parasites, and the Empyrean flesh she inhabited as a cage that bound her to a destiny she did not choose. Ranni's rebellion was a cold and calculated pursuit of autonomy. She sought to usher in the age of the stars, a world where the divine would be distant and the inhabitants of the lands between would be free to chart their own course. To achieve this, she had to discard her Empyrean flesh and sever her connection to the greater will entirely. She stole a fragment of the rune of death from Malekith, imbuing the daggers of her black knife assassins with the power to slay a god. This was the beginning of the end for the Golden Order, as Ranni prepared to commit the first act of deicide in history. The ritual Ranni performed was one of dual destruction. For her soul to survive the death of her body, another demigod's soul had to be destroyed while their body lived on. She chose Godwyn the Golden as her anchor, ensuring that the mark of death was split between them. On the night of the Black Knives, Ranni committed ritual suicide, her body perishing atop the divine tower of Liurnia, while her soul fled into the artificial form of a four-armed doll. She had successfully escaped the reach of the Two Fingers, but she had done so by setting the world on fire. Ranni's rejection of her shadow, the loyal beastman blade, was the final step in her isolation. The shadows were gifts from the Two Fingers, intended to serve as enforcers of the order. If an Empyrean rebelled, the shadow would go mad and turn on them. Ranni accepted this tragedy as a necessary cost of her freedom. She retreated into the shadows of the Ranni's Rise Tower, surrounded by her small group of conspirators, waiting for the moment when a Tarnished might help her complete her journey to the Dark Moon. She was the architect of the world's collapse, a woman who chose the cold of space over the warmth of the gold. The significance of Ranni's rebellion lies in its absolute refusal to compromise. She did not want to fix the Golden Order or build a better tree. She wanted to erase the very concept of a central, governing god. Her Age of the Stars was a vision of a world where the divine order was millions of miles away, leaving the people to live and die in the quiet of the night. This was the ultimate heresy against the greater will, a move that would eventually lead to the total shattering of the Elden Ring and the end of Marika's age. Ranni remains one of the most polarizing figures in the history of the lands between. To some, she is a liberator who freed the world from the tyranny of the Fingers. To others, she is the cold-hearted murderer who destroyed the Golden Age for her own selfish desire for freedom. Her actions on the night of the Black Knives were the catalyst for everything that followed, proving that a single Empyrean's will was enough to break a cosmic law. Ranni had cast aside her flesh and her fate, becoming a ghost in the machine of the world, a doll queen who watched as her family tore itself apart in the wake of her crime. Part 23. The Night of the Black Knives. The Night of the Black Knives was the catastrophic pivot point that shattered the psychological and spiritual foundation of the Golden Order. It was a perfectly coordinated strike led by a group of Numen women known as the Black Knife Assassins, who moved through the capital of Lendel with a terrifying, supernatural silence. These women were scions of the Nox, carrying a deep-seated resentment toward the Erdtree and the Greater Will. Using the fragment of the Rune of Death, stolen by Ranni, they struck down Godwyn the Golden, the firstborn of the Golden lineage and the shining pride of the world. This was the first time a demigod had died in the history of the Erdtree, and the impact was absolute. The assassination was not just a political murder, but a metaphysical violation. Because Ranni had timed her own death to coincide with Godwyn's murder, the curse mark of death was split in two. Godwyn's soul was completely annihilated, leaving behind a mindless, immortal body that the laws of the world no longer knew how to process. The golden sun was reduced to a hollow vessel in an instant. This event proved that the eternal age of Marika was a lie. The demigods were not invincible, and the goddess could not protect those she loved most. The security of the Erdtree was exposed as a fragile illusion. The night of the Black Knives sent the royal family into a spiral of paranoia and grief. Marika, faced with the horrific half-death of her favorite son, reached her breaking point. The loss of Godwyn was the final crack in her faith, leading her to question the very order she had spent eons building. The capital was plunged into a state of mourning that never truly ended. The assassins vanished into the shadows, their work complete, having successfully decapitated the golden lineage at its most vital point. The world changed in a single night of blood and ritual, and the light of the gold began to dim. The ritualized nature of the murder left a permanent scar on the reality of the lands between. The Black Knives did not just kill Godwyn, they branded the world with the mark of death. The presence of the assassins within the capital proved that the Golden Order had enemies in its own shadow, and that the new men, Marika's own race, were capable of the ultimate betrayal. The trust that had held the demigods together was dissolved, replaced by a cold suspicion that would eventually lead to the War of the Shattering. The night of the Black Knives was the moment the dream of the Erdtree died. The fallout of this event was a slow-motion apocalypse. The death of Godwyn's soul, without the death of his body, created a biological monster that would eventually infect the entire world. The Order had been designed for a world where death was removed. It had no defense against a death that was half-finished. Marika's grief turned into a nihilistic rage against the greater will, as she realized that she was a prisoner of a system that had failed her. The night was a masterpiece of conspiracy, a strike that targeted the heart and the head of the Empire simultaneously. Ultimately, the Night of the Black Knives is the reason the game exists. It was the catalyst that drove Marika to shatter the ring, and the reason the Tarnished were eventually recalled. It remains the most significant act of violence in the history of the world, a crime that was both a liberation and a catastrophe. The Black Daggers had carved a hole in the universe that could never be filled, proving that even a goddess's firstborn could be brought low by a few ounces of stolen death and a burning desire for revenge. The Age of Gold had ended in a pool of black liquid on a palace floor. Part 24. Godwyn, the Golden Godwyn. The Golden was the pinnacle of the Golden Order's success, a demigod who embodied the mercy and the strength of the Erdtree. He was the hero who had befriended the dragons and the prince who had secured the peace of the capital. But after the Night of the Black Knives, his legacy became one of absolute biological horror. Because his soul was destroyed, but his body retained the boundless vitality of the golden lineage, he did not rot or pass away. Instead, he became a living corpse, a soulless mass of divine flesh that began to mutate and grow out of control deep beneath the earth at the roots of the Erdtree. In the deep root depths, Godwyn's remains transformed into a monstrous Piscine titan. His skin took on a clammy, grey texture, and eyes began to grow all over his body and the surrounding roots. He became the Prince of Death, a mindless organism that was copy-pasting its likeness through the Erdtree's underground network. He was no longer a man, but a biological event, a god-sized tumor in the fabric of the world. This transformation turned the Erdtree's soul recycling system into a delivery method for corruption. As Godwyn's soulless essence began to seep into the very water and soil of the lands between. The result of this infection was the emergence of Deathroot, a dark and thorny growth that began to sprout in graveyards and catacombs throughout the continent. Wherever Deathroot appeared, the laws of the Golden Order were suspended, and those who died nearby were unable to return to the tree. Instead, they rose again as those who live in death, a new race of skeletal beings who existed in a state of stagnant half-life. Godwyn had become the involuntary progenitor of a new, darker order, a god of the grave who offered an eternity of soulless wandering to those rejected by the gold. The state of Godwyn was a source of profound shame and horror for the survivors of the capital. They had buried him at the roots, hoping for a rebirth that would never come. Instead, they had accidentally poisoned the world. The golden sun was now the god of cancer, a being whose only function was to grow and consume. His presence beneath the earth turned the Erdtree into a parasitic structure that was feeding on its own rotting heart. The tragedy of Godwyn is the ultimate evidence of the failure of Marika's immortality. He was the man who could not die, and his existence became a universal curse. His body continues to spread, manifesting as secondary faces in places as distant as the pits of Stormvale Castle. Godwyn is everywhere and nowhere, a silent, pulsing witness to the decay of the world he once protected. He is the physical manifestation of the Knight of the Black Knives, a wound that will not scab over. The demigods who once loved him now fear to even speak his name, as he represents the absolute destruction of everything the Golden Order stood for. He is the Prince of Death, sitting on a throne of roots and eyes, waiting for a world that has already died to join him in the dark. Ultimately, Godwyn represents the wrong kind of immortality. He is the evidence that life without a soul is a monstrous and destructive force. By trying to remove death from the world, Marika created a version of death that was infinitely worse than the natural end. Godwyn is the foundation of the game's biological horror, a golden hero who became a fish-like monster because the universe didn't know how to let him go. He is the silent center of the apocalypse, the man who broke the world by simply refusing to leave it. Part 25. The Shattering. Driven to the absolute brink by the horrific half-death of her favorite son, and the cold, unmoving silence of the greater will, Queen Marika the Eternal finally committed the ultimate act of divine rebellion. In the heart of the Erdtree, she used her hammer to strike the Elden Ring, shattering the fundamental laws of reality into disparate fragments known as great runes. This was not a calculated political maneuver, but a scream of nihilistic despair, an attempt to destroy the very system that had failed to protect her lineage. By breaking the ring, Marika broke the world's internal logic, ensuring that the stagnant age of the Erdtree could no longer continue in its current hollow form. Radagon, the other half of her dual nature and a staunch defender of the Order, immediately attempted to repair the damage. He took up the same hammer and struck the shards in a desperate effort to mend the golden geometry, but his efforts were in vain. The fracture was too deep, and the goddess's intent too absolute. The two aspects of the godhead were locked in a literal struggle of creation and destruction, a conflict that ended with both of them being imprisoned within the Erdtree by the Elden Beast. The Elden Ring was no longer a unified law. It was a collection of jagged, powerful shards scattered among the children of the goddess. The immediate consequence of the shattering was the total withdrawal of the greater will from the affairs of the lands between. The two fingers, the cosmic envoys of the outer god, fell into a state of stunned dormancy, unable to provide guidance to a world that had lost its primary legal framework. So the grace that had once guided the inhabitants of the world became a flickering, unreliable light. Without a central authority to govern the power of the great runes, the lands between descended into a state of lawless divinity, where the strength of one's shard determined the extent of one's rule. The demigods, Marika's children and stepchildren, each claimed a fragment of the shattered ring. These great runes were not just symbols of authority. They were infusions of raw, cosmic power that warped the minds and ambitions of those who held them. The possession of a rune granted a demigod a portion of the world's governing law, turning them into petty gods with the power to reshape their own domains. This sparked a period of initial hope among the siblings that one of them might emerge as a new Elden Lord. But that hope quickly dissolved into a centuries-long nightmare of civil war. The Shattering transformed the lands between into a fragmented landscape of fortified encampments and scorched battlefields. The unity of the Golden Order vanished, replaced by a desperate struggle for dominance. Each demigod believed they were the rightful heir to Marika's throne, and none were willing to submit to the others. The world became a place of iron and blood, where the beauty of the Erdtree was overshadowed by the machinery of war. The era of the Eternal had ended, and the era of the Shard-bearers had begun, a time of absolute chaos that would last for generations. The act of shattering the ring was Marika's final victory over the Greater Will's stagnation. She had forced the hand of the cosmos, ensuring that a new order would eventually have to be forged from the wreckage of the old. She had cast her children into a crucible of war, daring them to become something more than puppets. But the price of this gambit was the total collapse of civilization. The world was left in a state of broken suspension, waiting for someone with the strength to gather the shards and decide the fate of a world that Marika had chosen to burn. Part 26. The Demigod Wars. The War of the Shattering was a stalemate of centuries, a protracted conflict that saw the demigods turn on one another in a futile struggle for the title of Elden Lord. Despite their immense power and the shards they carried, no single demigod was strong enough to conquer the others and claim the throne. Morgott, the Omen King, remained the secret protector of the capital city, Halendel repelling every assault from his siblings while remaining hidden from a public that would have loathed his Omen blood. He was the grace-given king of a dying city, the only one loyal enough to defend a throne that would never officially recognize him. In the west, Rykard, the Lord of Blasphemy, abandoned his post as a high adjudicator and allowed himself to be consumed by a great serpent beneath Mount Gelmir. He sought to gain the power to devour the gods themselves, turning his domain into a hellscape of fire and iron, where he fed upon the champions of the world. This was a war of absolute moral decay, where the pursuit of the great runes led to the abandonment of every knightly virtue. Rykard represented the total corruption of the golden lineage, a demigod who chose to become a monster rather than accept the stagnation of his mother's order. To the south, Mohg, the Lord of Blood and the twin brother of Morgott, established his own secret dynasty in the subterranean blood swamps. He sought to elevate himself through the service of an outer god known as the Formless Mother, using the kidnapped Miquella as a puppet for his new age. His war was one of shadows and kidnapping, a cult-like rebellion that targeted the very lifeblood of the world. Mohg represented the hidden, festering resentments of the crucible blessed, who had been cast out of the light, attempting to build a world of blood beneath the roots of the gold. The various campaigns and sieges of the Shattering left the lands between a scarred and hollowed-out ruin. Great cities were abandoned. Gia and the armies of the demigods were reduced to wandering bands of hollowed soldiers who continued to fight for lords who no longer cared for them. The social and political structures of the old world were completely dismantled, leaving only the law of the strongest. The demigods became isolated in their respective fortresses, hoarding their great runes like dragons, while the world beneath them slowly died of exhaustion and neglect. The war also saw the intervention of various outer gods who sought to fill the vacuum left by the Greater Will's silence. The god of Rot, the Formless Mother, and the Flame of Frenzy all began to exert their influence through the desperate demigods and their followers. The Shattering was no longer just a family dispute. It was a cosmic proxy war where the planet was the prize. The demigods were no longer leaders of a civilization, but vessels for competing divine philosophies, each more destructive than the last. The stalemate ensured that the suffering of the world would be prolonged indefinitely. The demigod wars proved that Marika's children were incapable of leading the world into a new age. They were too tied to the traumas and ambitions of the past to envision a future beyond the struggle for the ring. The stalemate was a sign of total systemic failure. The greater will, seeing that no shard-bearer would emerge victorious, finally abandoned the demigods entirely. This abandonment paved the way for the recall of the tarnished, the long-discarded warriors who were now the only hope for a world that the demigods had successfully broken but could not repair. Part 27. The Battle of Aeonia, the final, devastating climax of the War of the Shattering, occurred on the plains of Caelid, in a confrontation known as the Battle of Aeonia. This was the meeting of the two most powerful demigods left on the board, Malenia the Severed, the Blade of Miquella, and Star-Scourge Radagon, the titan who held the very stars in place. They were the two champions who could have ended the stalemate, representing the final hope for a decisive victory in the war for the Elden Ring. The battle was a clash of absolute martial perfection against absolute celestial strength, a fight that determined the fate of the entire southern continent. The battle reached a terrifying standstill, as neither champion could find a decisive advantage. Radagon's gravity-defying power and his immense physical stature matched Malenia's supernatural speed and her mastery of the waterfowl dance. They fought until the ground was littered with the corpses of their respective armies, the Cleanrot Knights and the Redmane soldiers. In a moment of absolute desperation, Malenia realized she could not defeat the Star-Scourge through swordplay alone. To fulfill her brother's vision and secure the win, she chose to unleash the one thing she had fought her entire life to suppress, the Scarlet Rot. Malenia bloomed in the heart of Aeonia, releasing a concentrated explosion of divine decay that nuked the entire region. The Scarlet Rot was an influence from an outer god that bypassed all defenses, infecting the very earth and the souls of everyone present. This act of biological warfare transformed the once vibrant Caelid into a red-hued hellscape of fungus, rot, and mutated monstrosities. It was an act of supreme sacrifice and supreme cruelty, as Malenia gave up her dignity and her sanity to ensure that Radagon could not claim victory. The result of the battle was a tragic and absolute draw. Radagon was infected by the rot, which slowly ate away at his mind until he became a mindless, howling beast who spent his days wandering the dunes and feasting on the corpses of friend and foe alike. He was left a shell of a hero, still holding the stars, but no longer remembering why. Malenia was carried back to the Haligtree by her loyal knight Finlay, falling into a deep, rot-induced coma. Both champions were effectively removed from the game of lordship, leaving their respective domains in a state of permanent, decaying suspension. The Battle of Aeonia was the final nail in the coffin of the Shattering. With the two strongest demigods incapacitated, any hope for a unified ending to the war vanished. Caelid became a warning to the rest of the world of what the power of the demigods could truly do when unleashed without restraint. The rot began to spread slowly toward the heart of the lands between, a physical manifestation of the stagnation and the decay that had already taken root in the souls of the royal family. The war had ended, not with a coronation, but with an apocalypse. Ultimately, Aeonia represents the total moral failure of the demigods' ambitions. They were willing to destroy the very world they sought to rule just to prevent a sibling from winning. The battle left the lands between a stagnant ruin, where the two greatest warriors of the age were reduced to a coma and a madness. The Shattering had reached its logical conclusion, the total exhaustion of all potential. The world was left waiting for a new variable to enter the equation, a force from outside the cycle of demigod pride that could finally settle the score that millennia and Radagon had left in the blood and the rot. Section 7, The World, The Tarnished Inherits, Part 28, The Start of the Game. At the dawn of the game's events, the lands between have reached a state of absolute entropic stagnation. The War of the Shattering has long since faded into a series of localized skirmishes, leaving the continent a world of ruins, ghosts, and aimless hollowed soldiers. And because the rune of death remains sealed, and the Elden Ring remains broken, the natural cycles of life and death have completely ceased. No one is truly being born, and no one is truly dying. The inhabitants of the world simply persist, their minds and bodies slowly eroding over centuries of unchanging afternoon. The world is a museum of its own collapse. In this moment of total systemic failure, the Erdtree performs a final, desperate act of self-preservation. It releases the call of grace, a golden light that reaches across the fog and into the distant Badlands and beyond. This call is directed at the Tarnished, the descendants of Godfrey's exiled warriors who were once stripped of their grace and cast out of the world. They are being recalled to the lands between as a last-ditch effort to find a new Elden Lord. The very people Marika once rejected have become the only force capable of saving her broken world. The Tarnished arrive as outsiders in a land that has forgotten the meaning of change. They find a world where the demigods have retreated into their fortresses, too broken or too proud to act, and where the two fingers offer only cryptic and outdated guidance. The Tarnished are tasked with a mission of near impossible scale, to hunt down the demigods, claim their great runes, and journey to the foot of the Erdtree to mend the Elden Ring. They are the new blood being injected into a dead organism, a variable that the stagnant order cannot account for. The world the Tarnished walks into is one where the history of the past is visible in every charred bridge and collapsed tower. There is no central government and no safety. There is only the law of the rune. The environmental storytelling reveals a world that has been in a state of post-apocalypse for so long that the apocalypse itself has become the status quo. The Erdtree still towers over everything, but its light is dim and its leaves are falling. It is a world that is waiting for an ending that has been delayed for 1,000 years. For the Tarnished, this is a journey of rediscovery and conquest. They must navigate the rivalries of the demigods, the influence of the outer gods, and the hidden agendas of the various factions that still linger in the ruins. They are not heroes in the traditional sense, but scavengers and warriors who have been given a single, narrow path to divinity. The start of the game is the moment the stalemate is finally broken, as a nameless warrior of no renown begins to gather the power that the children of Marika could not hold. Ultimately, the state of the lands between at the beginning of the game is a testament to the failure of the eternal dream. Marika's attempt to create a world of unchanging gold resulted in a world of unchanging rot. The Tarnished are the evidence that the Golden Order must be destroyed or transformed to continue. They are the agents of the end times, the ones who will finally decide if the world should be mended, burned, or abandoned to the stars. The long silence of the Shattering is over, and the final movement of the history of the lands between has begun. Part 29. The Underground World. Deep beneath the surface of the lands between lies a vast and forgotten world that serves as a graveyard for civilizations that predated the Erdtree. This subterranean realm is a landscape of high stone ceilings, false stars, and the ruins of the Nox and their eternal cities. It is a place where the logic of the Golden Order has never fully reached, allowing the influences of other outer gods to fester in the dark. The underground world is the subconscious of the planet, a place where all the things Marika tried to bury, the rot, the blood, and the ancient stars, continue to pulse with a life of their own. The most terrifying of these subterranean regions is the Lake of Rot, a massive cavern filled with the concentrated essence of a sealed god of rot. This is the source of the plague that afflicts Malenia, a place of stagnant, pink-hued liquid that consumes everything it touches. The lake is a reminder that the world's biology is not just golden and green, but can be warped by cosmic forces that the greater will cannot exclude. It is a place of absolute decay that exists directly beneath the pure lands of Liurnia, proving that the foundation of the world is often more horrific than the surface suggests. Nearby, the Godwyn Palace stands as a monument to the ambitions of the Lord of Blood. Mog built his dynasty in the shadows of the ancient Nox ruins, using the blood of the earth and the influence of the Formless Mother to create a new, dark order. This palace is the heart of a blood cult that seeks to replace the Erdtree with a system based on pain and sacrifice. The underground world provides the privacy and the primal energy required for such blasphemy to grow, hidden away from the prying eyes of the Two Fingers and the Golden Capital. The underground also houses the roots of the Greattree, the ancient plumbing system that continues to process the dead of the world. This is where the corruption of Godwyn has taken hold, turning the subterranean water into a delivery system for the death route. To explore the underground is to see the physical evidence of the world's systemic infection. It is a place of aquatic horrors and sightless eyes, where the memory of the golden sun has been replaced by the reality of the Prince of Death. The underground is where the world's history is physically decomposing. For this hidden world matters because it contains the tools and the truths required to understand the Shattering. Many of the game's most important items and lore revelations are found in the dark, from the Fingerslayer blade to the secrets of the Mimic Tears. The underground world represents the old powers that refuse to be erased, the civilizations and gods that were banished but never truly defeated. It is the dark mirror to the Erdtree's light, a place where the tarnished must go to find the power that the surface world has long since lost. Ultimately, the underground world proves that the lands between are a multi-layered tragedy. The Golden Order is just the most recent skin over a world that has been inhabited and abandoned many times over. The ruins of the Nox and the palaces of the Bloodlord are the evidence that the Greater Will's order is an occupation of a much older and more chaotic space. By descending into the depths, the Tarnished learns that the world is far larger and more terrifying than the Erdtree's grace suggests, and that the future of the planet may be tied to the secrets buried in the dark. Part 30. The Realm of Shadow. The Land of Shadow is a hidden and veiled region that was once the original Lands Between, the geographical and spiritual heart of the world, where the divinity of Marika began. It is a place of jagged peaks, ancient towers, and the massive spectral Scadutree, a dark mirror to the Erdtree that represents the shadow cast by the gold. This realm was physically and conceptually separated from the rest of the world by Marika's divine veil. She turned into a secret prison for the history she wished to forget. It is a land where all manners of death wash up, a place where the physical debris of every era is gathered in a stagnant, grey landscape. The history of the realm of shadow is the history of Marika's trauma and her subsequent vengeance. It contains the shaman villages where she was born and the jars where her people were mutilated. It also houses Enerilim and the Gate of Divinity, the place where she ascended to godhood. By veiling this region, Marika was attempting to erase her own humanity and the horrific price she paid for her power. The Land of Shadow is a realm of original sin, a place that proves the Golden Order was built on the bones of the Hornsent and the blood of the shaman women. The Scadutry itself is a monument to this erasure. It is a twisted and leaking structure that lacks the grace of the Erdtree, serving as the dumping ground for the world's spiritual waste. While the Erdtree represents life and eternity, the Scadutry represents the inevitable decay and the dark half of the cosmic order. It is the tree of the discarded, the shadow that must exist for the gold to shine so brightly. The Land of Shadow is the place where the Golden Order's order breaks down, replaced by the raw, unrefined forces of death and the base serpent. Messmer the Impaler remains the master of this realm, his crusade against the Hornsent having turned the land into a charred mausoleum. He is the eternal jailer of his mother's secrets, guarding the Shadowkeep and the Gate of Divinity from any who would dare to uncover the truth. The Land of Shadow is a world of permanent war and permanent stagnation, where the soldiers of the crusade continue to fight a people who have already been broken for centuries. It is the hell of the Elden Ring universe, a place of absolute, silent suffering. The revelation of the Land of Shadow changes the player's understanding of Marika's character. She is no longer just a distant goddess or a grieving mother. She is a survivor who turned her own homeland into a graveyard to protect her image of perfection. The realm proves that the Golden Age was an artificial construction maintained through absolute censorship. Every grace-guided step the Tarnished takes on the surface is built upon the silent screams of the Shadow Realm. It is the final, most important piece of the world's puzzle, the place where the gold and the shadow meet. Ultimately, the realm of shadow is the graveyard of the world's original potential. It is the place where the crucible was most vibrant and where the first attempts at divinity were made. By entering this land, the Tarnished confronts the raw, bloody source of the world's order. It is a place of profound melancholy and absolute horror. A reminder that no goddess is so powerful that she can outrun her own past. The veil has been lifted, and the Land of Shadow now stands as the final witness to the cost of Marika's eternal dream. Part 31, Shadow of the Erdtree. The journey into the Land of Shadow reveals the final, desperate gambit of the Empyrean Miquella to fix the world that his mother and father broke. Miquella, having abandoned the Haligtree after his kidnapping by Mog, travelled to the Shadow Realm to follow Marika's footsteps to the Gate of Divinity. His mission was one of absolute sacrifice. He discarded his flesh, his great rune, and even his love in the form of Saint Trina, all to become a god of a new, kinder order. He sought to create a world governed by compassion and the removal of conflict, a vision of peace that would resolve the stagnation of the Shattering. However, the DLC reveals that Miquella's path was destined to repeat the same mistakes as Marika's. By discarding his humanity and his capacity for love to reach the gate, Miquella became a god of absolute, terrifying compulsion. His compassion was not a choice, but a divine decree that stripped his followers of their agency, forcing them into a state of blissful, mindless loyalty. He was building an order that was just as shackled and artificial as the Golden Order, replacing the gold of Marika with the gold of his own charms. He was a child god who wanted to save the world by turning everyone in it into a puppet. The sacrifice of Saint Trina is the emotional heart of this tragedy. Trina, the manifestation of Miquella's love and his connection to sleep and dreams, was cast into the deepest pit of the Shadow Realm to ensure that Miquella was pure enough for godhood. She remained there as a wilted, beautiful flower, begging the Tarnished to kill Miquella rather than let him become a god. She understood that a god without love is merely a cage with a different name. Miquella's pursuit of divinity was a journey of self-mutilation that resulted in a god who was kindly but hollow. The climax of Miquella's journey was his attempt to bring back Radagon as his promised consort. Using the body of Morg as a vessel, he sought to combine his divine charm with the Star Scourge's martial strength to create a new, unstoppable lordship. This was the final echo of the Marika Godfrey union, her attempt to restart the cycle of God and Lord. But this new union was born of kidnapping, blood rituals, and the suppression of the soul. Miquella had become a monster in his pursuit of being a savior, proving that the gate of divinity only produces tragedies. Miquella's failure is the final proof that the world cannot be fixed through the same methods that broke it. You cannot build a better world by discarding the parts of yourself that make you human. His age of compassion would have been a world of beautiful, stagnant smiles, a dull eternity that was no better than the one Marika created. The Tarnished's intervention in the Shadow Realm is an act of mercy, stopping a child god from repeating the cycle of cosmic occupation. Miquella's sacrifice was in vain, a beautiful and horrific detour in the world's final hours. Ultimately, the story of the Shadow Realm provides the final context for the game's ending. It shows that even the most gifted and compassionate among the demigods could not find a way out of the greater will's trap. Miquella's journey was a shadow play of his mother's ascension, a reminder that the order of the Erdtree is a cursed inheritance. As Miquella fades into the ash of the Shadow Realm, the world is left with no more demigods to save it. The responsibility falls entirely on the Tarnished to find a path that does not involve gates of corpses or trees of gold. Part 32. The endings. The timeline of the lands. Between reaches its final conclusion when the Tarnished stands before the fractured remains of Marika and the Elden Beast. At this moment, the player must choose between several divine philosophies that will dictate the future of the world. From the Age of the Stars to the Blessing of Despair, each ending represents a different reaction to the failure of the Golden Order. The choice is the final act of the game's history, the moment where the stagnation of the Shattering is finally broken by a single, definitive will. The Tarnished makes the choice that Marika was too terrified to make, to finally decide what the world deserves. The Age of Stars, ushered in by Ranni, she represents the total removal of the divine from the physical world. It is a path of cold, distant starlight, where the inhabitants of the lands between are left to govern themselves without the guidance of fingers or trees. It is the ultimate liberation, but it is also a path of absolute isolation. The gold is replaced by the moon, and the world is granted the freedom to live and die in the quiet of the night. It is the end of the age of gods and the beginning of a truly human, albeit cold, future. In contrast, the various versions of the Elden Lord endings represent an attempt to mend the existing system. Whether it is the Age of Fracture, the Age of Order, or the Age of the Duskborn, these endings seek to incorporate new laws into the Elden Ring to fix its flaws. These paths are inherently conservative, believing that the world still requires a central governing gold. They provide a sense of stability and a return to the norm, but they also risk repeating the cycle of stagnation if the new law is just as rigid as the old one. They are the choice for those who still believe in the dream of the Erdtree. The more extreme endings, such as the Lord of Frenzied Flame or the Blessing of Despair, represent the total rejection of the world as it exists. The Frenzied Flame seeks to burn everything back into the one great, erasing the fracture and the suffering of existence entirely. It is the ultimate nihilistic solution to a world of pain. The Blessing of Despair, on the other hand, seeks to defile the world so thoroughly that the concept of a curse becomes the new standard for everyone. But these are the choices of those who have been so broken by the Golden Order that they want to see the entire universe share in their agony. Each ending is a commentary on the history that came before it. The Age of the Duskborn honors Godwyn. The Age of Order honors Radagon. The Age of Stars honors the Nox and the Carians. The timeline ends with a question. Was the struggle for the Elden Ring worth it? The final image of the game, whether it is a world of starlight, a mended tree, or a burning horizon, is the final verdict on Marika's reign. The goddess remains a shattered statue, her work finished, leaving the world in the hands of the one who had the strength to survive her apocalypse. The history of the lands between is a cycle of occupation, rebellion, and decay. The Tarnished has navigated the ruins of the crucible, the legacy of the dragons, and the tragedy of the demigods to reach this final point. The timeline concludes with the understanding that no order is truly eternal, and that every golden age carries the seeds of its own shadow. The Tarnished steps forward into the unknown, a new lord or a herald of the end, while the Erdtree finally falls silent. The story of the gold and the shadow is over, and a new, unwritten age begins in the silence of the dawn.